Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to share some unique card background techniques using these interference pads. Now the inspiration for these particular backgrounds were these crushed velvet resin coasters that I made a while back. There's a video on it. You'll find it on my resin playlist. And I was curious if I could get a somewhat similar look with these interference pads using some cling wrap. Now those resin coasters, the effect was created using cling wrap, which is where this started. So I've got some press and seal on my desk here with the sticky side facing up, and I'm just trying to put the cling wrap on there all wrinkled up to try to create the waves, if you will. I'm using a black soot ink pad to ink that up, and then I'm pressing my cardstock into it. I'm going to take a piece of scrap cardstock or scrap paper and use that so I can really rub and press that background into there. And it did exactly what I was hoping it would do. So I'm going to make a few different backgrounds here and try to get some different looks with this cling wrap. Most of them are going to be just kind of a crinkly look similar to what I just did, and then I'll get a little bit creative with this. Now this press and seal on my desk wasn't the best solution because it kept moving around. So in a minute I come up with a little bit of a different way to get the similar effect but not have it move around as much on me. So I'm going to take my grip mat and use that with the cling wrap on it instead. Now when it came to the grip mat, it was a little bit harder to place it down because that cling wrap really wanted to cling to the grip mat, but it was a lot more firm and held it down a lot better than that press and seal did. So both of them will work, just depends on what you're going for. And what I found worked best was if I kind of wrinkled it or creased it in my hand a little bit before pressing it onto the grip mat. Now, this cling wrap can be used over and over again. I only grabbed a second and third piece for this part because the first one I had crinkled it up first, and I wanted to see without crinkling it up if I would get a little bit of a different look. So I've got it on here. I'm just using that same black soot pad to ink up the creases on that cling wrap. And then I'm also using that same piece of scrap paper to press it down and really get that background or that ink onto my cardstock here. So I'm going to do about 8 of these black and white backgrounds here, and you could use them as is like this if you wanted to. You could also ink them with just distress inks or whatnot and get a different look with that. You just won't have the interference properties that the interference pads have. Now these backgrounds, I'll tell you right now, were a lot more bold than I had really anticipated them looking. The one thing that I do wish I had done, and I didn't do it, but I'll probably do it at some point, is use some ink blending brushes and maybe blend a couple different colors on a background. I thought that would look a little bit interesting, but I didn't really think about that until I was completely done this. So here I took that same cling wrap. I used the ink side down so I wasn't going to get ink all over my fingers, kind of swirled it into kind of a rose-ish pattern, just kind of a swirl pattern, and then put my grip mat down to cling it onto the grip mat, and did that with both pieces. And I'm using that to ink my background here. This way I'm going to get a completely different look from the other creases. And I was just really curious to see how that would look behind those inks as well. I'm going to do that a couple times just to get a couple backgrounds like this. And once again, use that scrap piece of paper to really press it down and get that ink in there. Now, once you've done with this, you can toss your cling wrap or you can rinse it off and somehow store it for a future project. I decided to toss it. But here are those black and white backgrounds before I add any of the interference pad colors. Now, I started with my ink blending brush and I realized it was going to take far too long to get the ink all over that background. So I ended up going with the pad directly to the paper. Now by doing this, I got a lot more of the interference shine than you usually do when you're using the ink pad or the ink blending brush. So just be prepared if you do put the pad straight to the paper like this, that you will get a lot more of the interference shine, which is the shine that's supposed to happen just on the dark cardstock. You'll get a lot more of that, and you see it more once the ink has completely dried. So if you want to have a little bit less of that, I would use the ink blending brush. But I've used my pads so much. They are so juicy, but I was finding that I wasn't getting as much ink with my ink blending brush, and it almost seems like I need to start re-inking my pads. And I have those re-inkers on order, but they have not arrived yet. So we decided to go with this. And I am, you can see I'm moving my paper. I'm kind of going with the lines on the paper. I want, if there's any streaks in my ink, I want them to go along with the lines in the paper. And you can see how bright and bold those backgrounds were. When I was first thinking of this technique and using it, I was thinking they would be great for card backgrounds. But once I had the ink on there, they were just so bold and quite frankly so different from what I typically use that there's only one that I ended up using as a card background because I was kind of stumped. And I did have to take a few days to ponder the backgrounds and how best to use them to show off their properties, basically. I didn't want to use them as a background and then basically stamp over them or do something over them that would hide that. So I was trying to think of the best way to use them that you could see their vibrancy, but also see those interference properties. So the colors that I'm using, I just realized I forgot to actually mention that, are Pink Champagne, Peacock Tails, Magic Garden, and Galaxy Dream. So these, I'm using the same 4 colors throughout the whole set. This particular one here, this 4th one here is the Galaxy Dream. The green one that shows up was Magic Garden. The one that shows up as blue is Peacock Tails. And the one that showed up as really bright pink was Pink Champagne. And once these backgrounds are done, I just put them to the side so they can completely dry. And there's another background technique that I wanted to do before I started putting some cards together. So you can see how this Galaxy Dream one is really quite dark. You see a ton of the purpley pink interference with that one. The other ones, you see a lot more of the background color until you tilt it into the light, and then you see a lot of the interference here. So they do end up being really quite bright. And I just didn't have anything that was suitable just to have them as a background. But I do use that Galaxy Dream one as a background. So for my second background type, I'm using some mixed media heavy stock. And I apologize for the blurry recording here. It did that with these backgrounds, and I'm not really sure why my camera did that because it went back to recording as normal. But basically what I'm doing here is a distress background. I've got 2 different pad colors. I'm using the Galaxy Dream one here with the Pink Champagne, but I also have smooshed a little bit of the Black Soot Distress ink on there so that I get some of that black mixed up with them. So when you're using it for a distress background, I'm smooshing it against my media surface mat, then misting it with water to create some nice drips. I put my paper in there first just to get a coat of ink all over the whole background, using a heated tool to dry it. Now, when you dry it, you don't need to dry it 100%, like 90% dry is good. You just don't want any wet pools on there because any wet pools that are on there will just blend with what is on your mat. You do want it to be mostly dry so that you're creating layers. Now, this background, but I did them in 2 different color schemes, and I have to say they are my favorite. I love the look of these interference colors with that black mixing and then the layers on top. You get a really beautiful blend of just some interference sparkle or shimmer in spots, and then the colors of the ink pads really shine through with this. So I do use these ones as some backgrounds, but then I create a secondary background with this with the excess ink that's left over once I'm done my first background, and I use that for different die cut elements for some of the cards. Now, the longest part of this technique is using your heated tool to dry it in between time, but you do want those layers to dry before you dip it into the ink. You can let them dry on their own, but that would take a lot longer. Now, when I do backgrounds like this, I typically will dip it back into the ink, I want to say 2 or 3 extra times. And usually I have a background that I like, but you can do it more or less. If you liked that background after that first smoosh and didn't want to add any layers to it, you're good. If you wanted to do it 8, 9, 10 times or whatnot. If you still have ink on your surface and you still want to add more layers and don't feel that it's completely done, then keep on doing it. The great thing about these backgrounds is you can use exactly the same colors and do exactly the same thing. Supposedly, you're never going to get an identical background. So you can just keep working on it until you are done. Now I'm only using 2 of the interference pads plus a black, but you could use more if you wanted. I just wanted to have those interference colors coordinate with each other and have a little bit of the interference shimmer. So here's the second background I'm doing. For this one, I'm just using up the ink on my desk. It's not intended to be a complete background, although if you come up with something that you love, you absolutely could make it a background for a card or for whatever you're wanting to create. It doesn't have to cover the entire background of the cardstock. You do want to use mixed media heavy stock for this, or something that can handle some water. So even watercolor paper would be okay for this, but it would probably look a little bit different than using the mixed media heavy stock. But try them both and see which ones you like. You just need something that can handle the moisture and handle the water, because cardstock that is not meant for water reacts differently and doesn't hold the ink the same way. Now, if you wanted to create backgrounds like this but didn't have any of these interference pads, you could use just distress pads in whatever colors you were wanting, and then add a little bit of Perfect Pearls. Perfect Pearls are a mica powder that has a shimmer to it that's activated by water, so you wouldn't need to spray anything on it additionally once you're done, because the water you're using while you're creating will work to activate the binding agent that's in it. And you'll get a very similar look to this. It's not going to be exactly the same, but very similar. So it's a great way if you wanted to create a background similar to this, but didn't have the interference ink pads, you could get something that was close to it. So that was the first background. Now I'm going to repeat that exact same process, but this time I'm using the Peacock Tails and the Magic Garden. So we're going to have a combination of blues and greens here, and both of these have an interference property that is purple. So when you tilt this in the light, you'll get areas that have a bit of a purple shimmer to them. And once again, I'm mixing that with some of the black soot so that I have some of that black in that background, and it shows off some of those interference inks as well. And the process with this is going to be exactly the same as the first one. I smushed each pad on my media surface mat a couple times, then misted it with water, put the mixed media heavy stock in there, and I kind of twist it just to make sure to get everything covered. And then when I'm dipping the different areas in, I'm trying to be aware of where I want some more color. So if I've got a lot of green and I want to break that up, I will dip it into an area that has the black or the blue, or if I have a little bit too much blue, I will dip it into an area that has black or green. So I want to get some of those colors mixed throughout the thing. I try not to have blocks of color, and I like an overall print. And for the same thing for this one as I did with the last one, once I'm done with my background, I will take a second piece of mixed media heavy stock and I will create another background, and that one is intended to be die cut and used for different elements on the front of the cards. The cool thing about these backgrounds is I love the fact that you never get the same look twice, but the secondary background also looks really interesting, and again, completely different than the first. You're going to have a little bit less color, a little bit more splotches and splatters because there's a lot less ink and water on your surface. But they're just fun to create backgrounds for cards or to create papers for die cutting. You could also use this for, creating bookmarks or using for tags and stuff like that. Now the Heat It tool that I'm using with this, it looks like a blow dryer, but it doesn't blow air, it emits heat. So it's very similar to an embossing tool, but it's a little bit more of a gentle heat. So it works well for drying mediums, drying up the inks and the water for this particular thing. You could use an embossing tool, but you'd want to hold it a little bit farther away because you don't want to start scorching the paper or have it to get get too hot, because if it gets too hot, then the paper starts to curl a little bit more. It doesn't do that as much with the Heat It tool because it's, like I said, more gentle. You would not want to do this with a blow dryer because a blow dryer will blow air and it's going to take those pools of water that you have, and instead of just drying them, it's going to blow them. So it is important to have a tool that is going to do this properly and not, say, a hair dryer that's going to blow that ink around. If you don't have either one of them, once again, you can let this air dry. It's just going to take a whole lot longer. And the media surface mat that I have on my glass mat here also holds the ink differently. It holds it more in droplets. You could also use basically any one of those ink blending mats. There's a Ranger's Ink Essentials one. There's a few different ones on the market. You just want something that's going to hold that ink in the droplets, and it just helps create backgrounds that are a lot more interesting. And it helps to keep that ink separated, those colors separated a little bit. So now that that first background is completely done, I'm working on the second one. And once again, the purpose of the second one is to use up the ink that's on my mat, as well as just create a background that has some of the colors on it, some texture on it. It just makes a lot more interesting die cuts than solid cardstock. And you can't get this effect with doing ink blending. You might be able to get something close if you have different blotch or splatter stamps, but it's still not going to be the same as this. So it's a really cool way to use up that ink and have it not go to waste. Now, if you don't have quite enough ink for that second background, you can put more on your ink or on your media surface mat and add some more ink to it. I like the way that this is looking at. It's going to be great for some die cuts. So here are those 2 finished or 4 finished backgrounds there. The ones that I did for the first of each color, I'm going to use as backgrounds, and I'm using it with white and black texture paste, hoping to see the different ink colors and when I ink over top of the texture paste. So we'll see how that goes. So the first thing I want to do is tape those stencils down. Well, I tape the paper down first, then tape the stencils down. And then I'm using that same painter's tape to tape off any areas of this stencil that I don't want it to get any texture paste into. It's a little bit easier to tape off those areas than try to control that palette knife. That way I can make sure not to get ink or texture paste in the areas that I don't want it to go. Now I have to say the black texture paste kind of overwhelmed the white. So if I were to do this again, I probably would put the black down first and then go in with the white so I get a little bit more of that light color in there. But live and learn. So I'm putting the white texture paste basically on the flowers, and then I'm going in and putting some of the black. And like I said, the black pretty much covered and overwhelmed the white. So I got more black texture paste on these backgrounds than I had originally intended. But again, this is the first time that I've actually mixed different texture paste colors on a background. Obviously, once you've used that black texture paste and you've got a little bit of white in there, you can't put it back into your container. So either get another stencil and put it through on another background, or it has to be disposed of. So once I let them completely dry, I tape my paper down again and then line up that stencil again. Once again, I am taping off any area I don't want stenciled on, just to make sure that that ink blending brush doesn't go there. And then I'm going to use the same interference pads that I used for the background, and I'm going to ink up the texture paste. Now, the texture paste didn't take the ink as much as I thought it would. I thought I was going to see a lot more of the interference colors on there, and you do see a slight shimmer to it, but not as much as I thought you were going to. And it might be the fact that the texture paste has a matte finish to it. So even though it has the tooth, it just doesn't have a smooth surface for those interference colors to shine. Anyways, it's a good experiment. It was neat to see how those pads would react with the interference colors. I love the texture paste on that background. It just gave it some dimension as well as a little bit of a different texture. Another way to get that pattern without the addition of texture paste would be to ink through the stencils first with some black distress ink or white pigment ink. Dry off the pigment ink if that's what you end up using, and then match up the stencil again and ink blend with those interference pads. So there are ways to do this if you didn't have the texture paste or didn't want to use the texture paste. There are ways to use it without it. I like the extra texture paste on there because it just adds a little bit of dimension and just, like I said, a different texture to it. So now I'm doing the second background. So this is the one where I use the Peacock Tails as well as the Magic Garden. I'm doing the same process as the first background. I matched up my stencil and taped it in place as well as taping the paper. Now you'll notice I had to uncurl the paper once the texture paste was on there. Once it dried, it kind of curled the paper up a little bit, but you can easily go opposite to that and uncurl the paper. So I am using my ink blending brush and putting the ink where I want that particular color to go. So if the texture paste is black, I'm kind of paying attention to what color is going to show up and where I want that to go. So these interference colors, if you haven't seen any of my interference videos before, and I have a playlist now that I'm putting them all into, I just realized that I forgot to mention these pads show up differently on black than they do on white. So on black, you're going to see the color that's on the left side of the stamp pad case. And on white, you're going to see, on white, you're going to see the color that's on the left of the cover, and on black, you're going to see the color that's on the right of the cover. Now, these backgrounds that I first did kind of go a little bit against that because I used the pads directly to the paper. You see a lot of the color on the white, you see a lot of the pink, and then in the shimmer or in the light, you see a lot of the interference or the shimmer to it. But I love how these pads do two different things and you can get several different colors out of them. To me, I refer to them as my magic pads because it's kind of magical. So for the first card that I'm doing, I did the background with the interference pads and then the texture paste, and I'm using some of the secondary distress background that I created as well as one of the pink backgrounds, and I used them to die cut pieces to create this little bird for the front of the card. Now I thought it had a little bit, it was showing up a little bit too bright, so I took my black distress pad and inked around it just to kind of give it a little bit of shadow as well as darken the color a little bit. Later on in this video, I'm going to redo this bird because I found it was a little bit too dark and didn't show up as well as I wanted it to on this background. But at this point, I thought it was looking great. It was after looking at it and seeing it for a while that I kept thinking that that bird was a little bit dark and it didn't pop off the background as much as I wanted. So I have a light purple card base here that I'm gluing that background to, and I'm using that background with the texture paste exactly as it is, showing it that whole background because I love how much texture and how much of the color you see on there. For the bird itself, I put a little bit of glossy accents in its eye, and once it was dried, it kind of really made that eye start to glow. So this is the card as it is now, and later on you'll see me change it up a little bit. So now we're going to work on that blue and green distress background. So I have a blue card base that I'm using here, and I'm gluing the background onto it. I have the background cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, so you see a little bit of that blue background, and I'm gluing everything down with Barely Art glue. I have it in a nice fine tip bottle so I can use it for both that background as well as for some of the die cuts that I will be using. Originally, I was going to die cut that background and then use the secondary distress background for the bottom layer with this butterfly. So these butterfly die cuts have one layer that has cutouts in them and one layer that's solid. But when I did that, I didn't see as much of the colors from that background as I wanted. So I took one of the blue backgrounds from the beginning and used that for the solid layer. I only glued down the center of the butterfly so I could bend and have those wings facing up just to give a little bit of extra dimension. And then I used some black enamel accents for the body of the butterfly. It ties in the black as well as the fact that it's nice and shiny, so it gives a little bit of a different texture. Let that aside to dry. And then for this particular blue background, I decided to use it as a background. I kind of thought it looked a little bit like a cloudy sky at night with the interference being a little bit purple. So I wanted to use it with these tree silhouette dies. I'm using part of that black as a matte behind the blue, and then I'm using part of it for the front for the trees, and they're just going to join up together, so it's going to look like a black mat, and those trees are going to be solid at the bottom. The one thing I didn't think about when I was cutting these pieces out is that this tree die was going to cut a little bit of the edges of the mat out, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. Once I glue this down and then glue the blue piece on and then glue the trees on, you can see there's little white cutout bits that show up, and I wasn't thinking about that when I was thinking about the die cutting, but I'll show you in a second how I fix that. So I've got this black piece. It was 5.5 by 4.25, and then I got the blue piece cut down to 4 inches by 5.25. And here's where you can see those white bits on the side of the cards on both the left and the right side. So I'm going to glue down these trees, and this is where that fine tip really comes in handy, because I can put it on all the little tiny branches really quickly and easily, and then glue down that black tree die cut. So to fix those white edges, I'm just taking my black distress pad with a detailed ink blending brush, and I'm going to ink those sides. And unless you look really, really closely at it, you can't see that that's ink there. The other option would be to keep any of those little bits that got die cut out and glue them onto the background of the card. But by this point, I had already thrown any of those little bits out, and I hadn't realized that this happened. For this card here, this is another one where I'm using the original background. So this is the Galaxy Dream background, and I have a piece of velvet cardstock here that has an adhesive back to it. Now this velvet cardstock, it just has a rich look to it, and I thought this background kind of had a rich look to it. So I'm using the Spellbinders and Anemones die, and I'm only wanting to use the outline of these flowers. So when I'm pulling this out of the die set, I'm only pulling out the outline. Those inside bits could be saved for a future card if you wanted to use that to inlay into those pieces. But for what I'm trying to create here, I only wanted that outline. So I'm carefully pulling that out. This cardstock is a little bit delicate. It's quite lightweight. So I did want to be careful and make sure that I wasn't ripping or tearing anything. Once I have everything out of that die, you can see how it looks really beautiful against that interference background. Now, when I placed this die, I was very intentional with how I was placing it. I placed it how I wanted it to show up on the card. And the reason I did that is so I can use that black piece as a mat around the Galaxy Dream piece. And then I could use it as a placement guide to put this piece on. Because this cardstock is quite delicate, I need to be careful when I'm taking this backing off to make sure that it doesn't fold in on itself and stick to itself. And I can put that piece or that die cut piece with the adhesive face up, place it in this part where it got cut out of it. Once it is down properly and I have everything placed, and if you have a problem with it sticking to your fingers, you can lick your fingers or use a sponge with some liquid to help it release from your fingers. I put that piece of Galaxy Dream on there and pressed it right down into the adhesive. Now my black piece there is 4 inches by 5.25, and my Galaxy Dream piece is cut at 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. So I have a really narrow mat on there. And the reason I did that narrow mat is because the fine lines in the die cut, I wanted it to kind of emulate that. So it made it really easy to place that background onto that die cut and have it placed properly. Before putting that velvet piece on my cardstock, I did take that Galaxy Dream background with the die cut already on there and glued it to that velvet piece. Like I said before, that velvet piece is quite thin and flimsy, and I figured if I was going to try to adhere that adhesive on there exposed, I was probably going to warp it. So by gluing that Galaxy Dream piece on there first, it gave it a little bit of heaviness and structure, and it made it easier to put that layer on there. I have a sentiment here that I have a little jar of sentiments, or a container of sentiments. So I picked it out from there, used some white cardstock to mat it so that it would tie into the white card base. Added a few extra strips of plain cardstock on the background to give it a little bit of dimension. And here we have a finished card. Very, very simple in concept, but that velvet cardstock makes it look so rich. While I was completing that velvet one, I was looking at this one thinking it really, really needed a sentiment. I had planned to leave it and just put a sentiment on it when I decided to give it out. But because I was going through those sentiment tin anyways, I decided to just pull one out. I used the coordinating ink pad in order to ink that so it would match perfectly, and then just glued it on flat. For the next card, I'm using one of the Magic Garden backgrounds, and I'm just using a simple stamp on it. By using a stamp on it, it's going to break up that whole background, and I'm going to ink it with Versamark ink. And I'm using my Misti stamping tool so that if by chance I don't get a clear image the first time and need to restamp it, I can easily do that and make sure that it's in the proper place. But I got the complete image the first time, so didn't need to do that. I'm just going to emboss it with white embossing powder. I plan on putting this on a white card base, so that white embossing powder is going to tie in. And then I'm going to use that distressed background butterfly that I had created before and create a butterfly to go on top of it. Just give it a little bit of extra dimension and just break up some of that green. The one thing I did find with these backgrounds is they made better die cuts simply because there was a lot of color. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning. What I would do next time is do some ink blending and do a couple colors at once, just to give them a little bit more interest and not be so much of one bright color. Once I am done embossing this image here, I'm using my trimmer, just trimming that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I'm going to glue that onto the front of a card. Now, like I said before, I planned to put this on a white card, but when I did that, it just looked a little off. So I grabbed this purple one and it tied in really, really well to the purple interference properties on this background. And it also tied into that butterfly. The one thing though is there was once again too much of the green. So I took my background, the one that I just showed there, cut out a second butterfly with the butterfly die that has the die cuts out of it and glued that to the top of that, and it broke it up a little bit more and it tied that purple back in there. For the center of this butterfly, I just used some glossy accents. It's just going to give it a little bit of shine and a little bit of shimmer. And then I took some Stickles and added just a touch to the outside of the wings, and that's also going to give it a tiny little bit of sparkle. This particular Stickles has some kind of bluey, purpley, greeny flecks in it, so it tied in really well to the colors there. So here is the finished card once it's completely dried. I love how that purple background looks with it. It really looked quite nice with that. Love the black die cuts on these backgrounds as well. They are really striking against them. And then there's the texture paste with the die cuts here. So here is the background with the original bird, but I did create a second one. And at this point, I wasn't really sure whether I felt comfortable pulling that bird off. So I just wanted to show you the bird with that card intact. Off screen, I did pull the top layers of the bird off and glued that second one down so you could see how it looked, and it looked much better with the brighter bird on it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.